We're on, okay. So I'm really delighted to be with you and to address this topic of the inclusion or the full participation of women in the life of the church today. In September 2013, a few months after his election as Bishop of Rome, in an unprecedented interview with Antonio Spadaro, that was published in a series of Jesuit reviews around the world, Pope Francis reflected on the role of women in the church and how it might be made more visible. He said the following: "Women are asking deep questions that must be addressed. The church cannot be herself without the woman and her role. The woman is essential for the church. Mary, a woman, is more important than the bishops. I say this because we must not confuse the function with the dignity. We must therefore investigate further the role of women in the church. We have to work harder to develop a profound theology of woman. Only by making this step will it be possible to better reflect on their function within the church. The feminine genius is needed wherever we make important decisions. The challenge today is this: to think about the specific place of women, also in those places where the authority of the church is exercised for various areas of the church." A short time later, in his apostolic exhortation following the Synod for the New Evangelization, The Joy of the Gospel, he observed that many women share pastoral responsibilities in the church today and are offering new contributions to theological reflection. Still, he suggested, as if to acknowledge that their changing role does not yet reflect their dignity and that their gifts have yet to be fully received, he said, "We need to create still broader opportunities for a more incisive female presence in the church." Going beyond his predecessors, who acknowledged the importance of honoring women's contributions in society, Francis is calling for a rethinking of women's participation in settings where important decisions are made through a fuller integration of their presence in church structures. Following the international synods on the family in 2014 and 2015, Francis deplored the persistent ill treatment of women in society, including domestic violence, due to the excesses of a patriarchal culture that considers women inferior. He welcomed the growing recognition of women's equality and affirmed that we must, quote, "see in the women's movement the working of the Spirit for a clearer recognition of the dignity and rights of women." And finally, in May of 2016, Pope Francis established a special commission in response to a request made by him by women religious to study more closely the possibility of restoring women's diaconal ministry. That commission carried out its work over a 2-year period, and its report now sits on his desk. These are some of the signs that we may be on the verge of a new and decisive advance toward a fuller recognition of women's dignity within the Catholic Church and a fuller integration of their gifts and competencies into the life of the Church. Still, many Catholic women remain wary of these overtures for reasons that I hope to make clear. While many positive steps have been made toward a greater inclusion of women in the past century, we've also experienced a troubling regression in recent decades, one reflected in the increasing precarity of basic human rights in civil society, but also in a systematic resistance to the insights and competencies of women in ecclesial life. Women are active in many significant ministries throughout the Catholic Church today, but their contributions remain largely unacknowledged and undervalued. Pope Francis is spot on when he observes that they have yet to be integrated in a coherent way into the structuring of ecclesial life. So in order to understand the complexity of this present moment, I propose a brief sketch of the trajectory of women's participation in the life of the Catholic Church since the Second Vatican Council. Pope John the 23rd had named the rising recognition of the dignity of women as one of the signs of the times to which the Church must attend as it sought to engage in a more constructive way with the modern age. The Council would affirm the equality of women and their right to self-determination. In its teaching on the Church as the pilgrim people of God, all of whom share in the priestly, prophetic, and royal offices of Christ by virtue of our baptism, the Second Vatican Council affirmed the equal dignity of every baptized Christian, women and men, lay and ordained, all co-responsible for the life and mission of the Church. These two insights concerning the dignity of woman as a person endowed with equal rights in human society, and the equal dignity of every member of the baptized faithful who have put on Christ through the sacrament of baptism, open the path to a new era of women's participation in a variety of ministries, old and new. We may be tempted to take these insights for granted today, but their importance should not be underestimated. Consider from whence we have come. When I first moved to Ottawa some years ago, my family came to visit. And so I proudly took my two young nieces around Parliament Hill. And following the requisite tour of the House of Commons, I took them to visit a monument to the famous Five next to the East Block of Parliament Hill. There stand 5 bronze statues. They've actually been moved this week because of the construction going on the hill, but we're taking care of them. These statues recall what is called the Persons Case, where in 1929, the hard-fought efforts of Nellie McClung, Emily Murphy, Louise McKinney, Henrietta Muir Edwards, and Eileen Parlby, politicians, suffragists, and journalists, led the British Privy Council to declare that women are persons before the law and therefore eligible to sit as members of the Canadian Senate. Now, my nieces could not fathom a time when women were not considered full persons in Canadian society, where they were essentially treated as minors before the law, unable to vote or hold public office, to obtain a loan or open a bank account without the signature of a male guarantor, to enter a public house without a male escort. This was not too long ago. It's fair to say also that few of my students today can remember a time when women did not teach theology or engage in pastoral ministry. In the Church, a community governed by an elite class of men, the role of women and women's agency has been and continues to be defined and circumscribed by men. Men determine the pattern of relations, structures, doctrines, laws, rituals, and the parameters of theological discourse, the system of language and symbols for speaking of God. Women religious, some of the Sisters of St. Joseph right here, might be able to recount the history of their communities and tell how they had a struggle against bishops and clergy to govern their own common life. The life of lay women in the Church was delimited by a basic principle of ecclesiastical law introduced in the Middle Ages and prevalent until the Second Vatican Council, which stipulated that the Church was made up of 2 classes of people, the ordained and the laity, those who govern and those who obey, those who teach and those who are taught, those who exercise spiritual power and those who are sanctified. Within a church understood as an unequal society, women were further defined theologically as morally weak, as dangerous temptresses leading men, like Eve, to sin, as defective and misbegotten males, and generally understood as irrational beings unsuited for leadership. When we consider the many contributions of women to the life of the church today against this horizon, much of what we now take for granted begins to emerge as a remarkable work of the Spirit. So I want to, for the next few minutes, spend a few words talking about the Second Vatican Council. If you know anything of the history of Vatican II, that historic gathering of the world's Catholic bishops to deliberate on the renewal and reform of the Church for a 4-year period from 1962 to 65, you might know that it got off to a rocky start. So it came as no surprise that women came as an afterthought. In attendance were 25 bishops, or 2,500 or so bishops, 220 or more theological experts, and over 100 ecumenical observers and guests. Because the council was to address the role of the laity, it was decided after the first session to invite lay auditors, first 13, then later 29 men. Cardinal Sunens and other bishops lamented the absence of women and convinced Pope Paul to add to their number. And in 1964, 13 lay women and 10 religious entered the council hall. Paul VI had invited them to attend as guests. As Carmen McEnroy, in her book on these women, has observed, the women of Vatican II experienced themselves very much as guests in their own house. Initially, Pope Paul thought they might attend only those sessions which dealt with topics of concern to women. As Christians, the women auditors quickly made it known that everything on the council's agenda was of interest to them. Many lay auditors were chosen for their experience on international organizations for the lay apostolate. They met together weekly and contributed especially to the work of subcommissions drafting the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World and the Decree on the Apostolate of the Laity. Their imprint is apparent in the Council's teaching on the ends of marriage and the family, economic and political life, war and peace, and the vocation of the baptized faithful. While the auditors did not have a vote, lay men were permitted to address the Council Fathers on 6 different occasions, reading speeches drafted together with their female counterparts. Women, however, were refused this privilege. Maria Pilar Bellosillo, president of the World Union of Catholic Women's Organizations, a network with 30 million members worldwide, this includes the Catholic Women's League, was scheduled to speak on the growing role of Catholic laywomen, but was then denied access to the AMBO by the Secretary of the Council Proceedings. When I teach my course on Vatican II's ecclesiology, students often ask when we're going to examine the Council's reflection on the question of women in the Church. And when I point out that the teaching of Vatican II does not treat women as a distinctive group of persons within the community of the baptized, some of them are tempted to conclude that the Council may have forgotten women, or that they had no part in the Council event or in the elaboration of its teachings. In point of fact, this small group of women was to have a significant impact on the Council's teaching. Even without a direct voice, their influence is unmistakable. An early draft of Vatican II's decree on the apostolate of the laity contained 2 large articles which reflected separately on the particular vocations of men. This article was entitled De Viris, and that of women, De Mulieribus, respectively. When discussing the proposed text with the bishops and theologians, Rosemary Goldie, a laywoman from Australia and executive secretary of the Permanent Council for the International Congress of the Lay Apostolate, objected. She said, "You can omit all those flowery objectives, the pedestals and incense from your sentences. All women ask for is to be recognized as the full human persons they are and to be treated accordingly." Pilar Bellosillo likewise cautioned the well-intentioned drafters of the decree against any poetic tributes to women. That kind of language, she observed, is detached from life and puts women on a pedestal instead of on the same level as man. In the end, these 2 paragraphs were dropped from the document. In response to the concerns raised by these and other women, the Council set aside any rigid categorization of male and female roles and opted to consider women under the inclusive, generic term hominis, human beings, a fact that is usually lost in translation when we revert to the less inclusive men. The women at Vatican II understood themselves to be fully included each time the Council documents referred to members of the baptized faithful. During the drafting of the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, Gaudium et Spes, Goldie was invited to convey the views of the women auditors as to whether the Council should address the question of women. She replied in the affirmative, on the condition, she said, that women are not isolated as a problem apart, as it were on the fringe of society in the modern world, or as if the real problems that women experience were their exclusive concern. Goldie gave an interview in this same period where she called for a consideration of women within a renewed ecclesiological framework that might lead to a more equitable church. She said, "There does not exist a church and then alongside it a problem of women, but a church of women and men. Since the church is a human society, she cannot develop normally without a certain balance and integration of the respective contributions of these men and women who are her members." So, through these interventions and the decisions of the Council Fathers, I think we can discern a deliberate intention to avoid, in the Council's teaching, the adoption of a theology of complementarity, one that would ascribe, I'm sorry, I have this cold. Sorry. Let's try this again. So, through the interventions and decisions of the Council Fathers, I think we can see an intention to avoid a theology of complementarity, one that would ascribe one set of charisms to women and another to men. The Council Fathers opted for an inclusive approach, where the baptized faithful are not defined according to gendered roles. No distinction is made when considering the participation of the faithful in the mystery of Christ through baptism, a dignity shared by all members of the Church. Considered in this light, Vatican II's apparent silence on the particular vocation of women should not be mistaken for the exclusion of women's perspectives. Indeed, its teaching on the fundamental dignity and basic equality of our baptismal vocation is perhaps the most revolutionary and liberating insight for Catholic women. Any reading of Vatican II's teaching must take seriously its commitment to present women as responsible, self-aware, self-determining, and full participants in society and in the life of the Church. The Pastoral Constitution on the Church acknowledges the aspirations of women within the human community, observing that today women claim equality with men in law and in reality, where they have not yet attained it. It underlines the divine source of women's equality as the basis of their quest for social justice, stating, quote, "Since all men and women created in the image of God have the same nature and the same origin, and since they have all been redeemed by Christ and enjoy the same divine calling and destiny, the basic equality which they share needs to be increasingly recognized," unquote. This fundamental equality grounds Vatican II's rejection of any discrimination on the basis of sex, which it deems, quote, "contrary to the purpose of God," unquote. Further, the Constitution deplores the denial of women's basic rights when they are subject to human trafficking, denied the choice of husband or state of life, or opportunities for education and culture equal to those of men. All of this is said in 1965. Vatican II's decree on the apostolate of the laity urges that since women play an increasingly important role in society, their participation in various fields of the apostolate should also increase. It observes that lay men and women are more deeply aware of the dignity of their baptismal vocation as sharers in the priestly, prophetic, and kingly offices of Christ and in his mission. So, quote, they cooperate energetically in passing on the Word of God, especially by catechetical instruction, through the care of souls and the administration of church goods, unquote. To carry out these tasks, the Council insists on the need for adequate formation, including access to theological education, and adds that those lay men and women who preside over prayers and teach doctrine ought to enjoy a decent standard of living and social security afforded by a just wage. Vatican II rightly envisioned most of the laity living out their baptismal vocation in the context of society, witnessing to and caring for family, neighbors, and communities in homes, factories, farms, offices, and schools. Finally, it acknowledges that some men and women have different calls and may be mandated to an explicitly ecclesial form of ministry in service to the people of God, like the women and men who assisted the Apostle Paul in the gospel, working hard in the Lord. So I want to talk next about two, I think, key developments since the Second Vatican Council, and that is first women doing theology and women involved in other ecclesial ministries. These few lines of conciliar teaching set the door ajar to new possibilities for women's participation in a host of new ministries. Just like my nieces who couldn't imagine a time when women were considered persons in Canadian law. Most theology students today can't imagine a time when women didn't study or teach theology. In 1943, Sister Madaleva Wolf of the Congregation of the Sacred Heart established the first graduate school of sacred theology for women at St. Mary's College in Notre Dame, Indiana. Her initial intention was to improve the level of education for sisters teaching in Catholic schools at the time, when no existing theology program would admit women students. This program quickly became an incubator for North America's first generation of women academically trained in theology. The first doctorates in theology were only awarded to women in North America in the 1960s. And then the next decade produced a generation of women scholars whose contributions have changed the landscape of contemporary theology. Rosemary Radford Ruther, Mary Daly, Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza, Pheme Perkins, Lisa Cahill, Joanne McWilliam, Elizabeth Lasselle, Anne Carr, Margaret Farley, Sandra Schneiders, Elizabeth Johnson. This first generation of Catholic women theologians stood on the shoulders of women who had gone before them in the struggle for women's rights in the social and political spheres. The term feminism was coined in the late 19th century to describe their movement for women's suffrage and property rights. Following the Second World War, a new wave of feminism emerged in conjunction with the American Civil Rights Movement. Through the 1970s and 80s, Christian feminist scholars, using a variety of methods and approaches, took the experience of women as a starting point for a critique of Christian theologies that marginalized women's perspectives or were experienced as an obstacle to women's relationship with God. They challenged the culture of patriarchy, a culture that encourages the subordination of women, fostered by structures where power and authority remain in the hands of dominant men. The critique of feminist theology rose out of women's lived experience of studying the Christian tradition. Elizabeth Johnson writes of her years as a graduate student, passionately absorbing the works of Augustine, Aquinas, Bonaventure, Ronner, Gutierrez. She writes, "But one day a question struck me. Where are the women? It's not as if women weren't actually there in the church, believing and contributing. But in the midst of all these insights, I became appalled by the silence of women's voices and the absence of their spiritual wisdom. Then I realized that I had no women professors, and not one assigned reading in any of my courses or doctoral comprehensive exam bibliographies was by a woman author. I soon came to understand that it was no accident that until recently, women have not been theologians. Barred from schools and seminaries where theology was taught, and from priesthood with its office to teach, women were excluded because of our so-called feminine nature, which, as men wrote, was less rational, less strong, less Christ-like than their own. The radical critique of a deconstructionist movement, feminist movement, soon gave way to a more positive and constructive movement of feminist theology, where Johnson and others sought to develop a systematic reflection on theological issues in a manner that was inclusive of women's perspectives and intended to provide a foundation for a church where women and men might live the gospel as co-disciples in a collaborative partnership of equals. Their scholarship has enabled us to recover many forgotten voices of women in the Christian tradition. by the time I began my graduate studies, and I didn't have a woman professor until my doctoral studies, their works were required reading. It should be said that not every woman theologian is writing on women's issues or taking an explicitly feminist approach to their study of the scriptures or of the Christian tradition. Many are simply writing theology from their various social locations. As one blogger puts it, theology by women is not done for women, nor is it only about women. Most often it's simply theology being done by people who happen to be women. Most women theologians, do not want our contributions to be reduced in a patronizing way to the woman's perspective. Rather, we seek to contribute as competent theologians who happen to be women. More recently, the theological community has begun to acknowledge the variety of women's voices. The experience of North American and European women cannot be taken as normative when fully 2/3 of the Catholic population resides today in the global South. Latin American, Asian, and African women are now finding their voices and contributing to theological conversation in significant ways. Their perspectives must be seen as increasingly relevant, not only for the role they play in their local context, they must come to enrich the understanding of the global Catholic community. Today, more than half the students in graduate programs of theology in North America are lay women seeking to deepen their faith, to prepare for some form of ministry in the church and society, or to prepare for a career in academic life. Women now make up about 30% of the North American community of scholars in theology, and that's about on par with the percentage of women across the humanities. At the same time, a new generation of women are taking their place in theological schools in the global South. So my next point is on the growing presence of women in ecclesial ministries. Apart from the increased presence and participation of women in theological education, the last half-century has seen a rise in new forms of lay ecclesial ministry, the magnitude of which no one at the Second Vatican Council could have predicted. The American ecclesiologist Edward Honenberg, who has written perhaps more than any other scholar on the emergence of lay ecclesial ministers, suggests that this is the most significant development in the ministerial structure of the Church since the founding of the mendicant orders in the Middle Ages. Ponder that for a moment. The most significant development in the ministerial structure of the Church since the founding of the mendicant orders in the Middle Ages. In the United States today, more than 39,000 lay ecclesial ministers work in salaried professional ministries to serve in Catholic parishes and dioceses, surpassing by far the number of ordained priests. Because the Canadian Conference of Bishops has not given sustained attention to this evolution, and individual dioceses do not appear to report these numbers in a consistent way, for example, in the Annuario Pontificio, or the Pontifical Yearbook, it's impossible to provide an accurate statistical picture for Canada. I note that the website for the Diocese of London provides statistics only for diocesan and religious priests, permanent deacons, and religious sisters and brothers. One statistic of interest, the 2018 yearbook lists 355,800 lay missionaries and 3.2 million catechists worldwide. I think it's more than reasonable to assume that much of this ministry is being accomplished by women. Though they remain largely uncounted, any realistic accounting for the ministerial life of the Catholic Church today must recognize that without paid or volunteer lay ministries, the pastoral life of our parishes, schools, and dioceses would soon come to a screeching halt. Lay ministers today serve as parish pastoral associates, catechists, youth ministers, campus ministers, religious educators, chaplains, parish administrators, canon lawyers, directors of pastoral formation, spiritual directors, liturgy coordinators, social justice coordinators, and diocesan chancellors. I'm sure I forgot a few. Where in the past many of these roles might have been filled by religious women, today in North America, 80% of ecclesial ministers are lay women. The fact that they are so often uncounted reflects the extent to which their work continues to go largely unacknowledged and has yet to be fully integrated into the structures of ecclesial life. Instead of seeing their growing contribution as a gift from the Spirit to the Church, their growing presence has often been perceived as an unwelcome disruption and a clear threat to the established ordering of ecclesial ministers. For a generation, it's fair to say that we've stood at a theological stalemate on the question of women in ministry, lay and ordained. One sympathetic ecumenical observer has gone so far as to speak of a war on women within Catholicism. In October of 1976, following the first ordinations of Anglican women in the American Episcopal Church, the Vatican's Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith issued a declaration on the admission of women to the ministerial priesthood, Inter Insignores, reaffirming the Vatican's condemnation of discrimination against women and noting Jesus' extraordinary attitude toward them. It reiterated the conviction that in not calling women to the ordained priesthood, the Catholic Church had remained faithful to the teaching and practice of Jesus and the apostles. To make its case, the declaration went on to great lengths to argue that since the priest acts in the person of Christ in the liturgy, the sacramental nature of the priesthood requires that the presider share a natural resemblance with Christ, namely the masculine sex, since the incarnation took place in the male sex. I'm sure that St. Thomas Aquinas, whose sacramental categories were pressed into service to make this case, never imagined they would be stretched so far. As might be expected, few were convinced by this poor theological reasoning. Many have argued forcefully that the capacity to reflect the image of Christ cannot be bound up with one's sexual similarity to the man Jesus. Conformity to Christ is an effect of the grace received in baptism that enables every baptized Christian, man or woman, to reproduce the pattern of Christ's self-giving love. Others have contended that the congregation failed to take sufficient account of the cultural context of Jesus' time, or the newness of the question of women's ministries in an age where their full humanity is taken seriously. In 1994, to put an end to debate on the ordination of women to the priesthood, Pope John Paul II issued an apostolic letter on reserving ordained priesthood to men alone. Wisely, he did not repeat the weak argument of the previous declaration. Nonetheless, he affirmed in strong terms that the Church has no authority to ordain women, insisting that such actions would break with the constant and universal tradition of the Church and disrupt its divinely constituted structure. In 1997, an instruction was issued under the signature of 7 congregations of the Roman Curia on certain questions regarding the collaboration of the non-ordained in the sacred ministry of the priest, seeking to address an apparent confusion of roles between lay pastoral workers and priests. As the title suggests, The perspective offered here insists that laypersons are not true ecclesial ministers in their own right. Their work is but a support and extension of the real ministry of ordained priests. Following the publication of this text, it's fair to say that in many places we witnessed a move away from commitment to professional lay ecclesial ministries. Bishops turned instead to the permanent diaconate and a coterie of volunteers, often with minimal training, to find collaborators in ministry. Many lay women in Canada, not finding support for the sharing of their gifts in parish and diocesan structures, turned instead to hospital, school, military, and prison chaplaincies, where they could be assured of more stable employment and a just wage. Throughout this period, Pope John Paul II produced a series of reflections aimed at promoting a theology of gendered complementarity, along the very lines that the Second Vatican Council had chosen to avoid. In 2011, after a protracted struggle between Vatican authorities, conferences of bishops, and liturgical scholars, a new English language sacramentary was issued for use in the English-speaking world. The ideologically driven translation of this text paid no heed to the policy decisions of Canadian and American bishops' conferences to make use of inclusive language in the liturgy. This battle against women also found expression in an investigation into the Leadership Conference for Women Religious in the United States, who were placed under the supervision of American bishops. The communities of these religious congregations belonging to this organization were also placed under investigation. Okay, I'll lay off now. When all these facts are lined up, it's not hard to see why many Catholic women are at best cautiously optimistic regarding Pope Francis' commitment to a fuller participation and inclusion of women in the structures and decision-making bodies of the Church. Until these suggestions are met with concrete structural change, they are likely to remain little more than pious sentiments. I have no reason to doubt the Holy Father's good intentions, but Catholic women have heard many of these platitudes before. Given Pope Francis' call for the pastoral and missionary conversion of the Church in the present context, there are a number of steps that might be envisioned in the short term that could move us toward his vision of inclusion. A colleague of mine recently surveyed young Catholic women to ask what they want from their church. She discovered that most young Catholic women are very tolerant of diverse religious beliefs, valuing authenticity over theological orthodoxy. They show considerable aversion to the polarization of views prevalent among post-Vatican II Catholics. Remarkably, the one thing they ask of their church is to be heard. They're longing to be listened to. Women are here, and to borrow a phrase from Cardinal John Henry Newman, the church would look silly without them. Without structures and spaces for dialogue, however, the gifts of baptized women cannot contribute meaningfully to the practice of discernment in the synodal church desired by Pope Francis. Every parish and diocese, and he's asked all of us to undertake this process of discernment and examine the structures and practices of our church at every level of ecclesial life. Every parish and diocese ought to conduct a thorough examination of its structures and ministries and ask, how are women's gifts and ministries being integrated into the structuring of ecclesial life? What place is given to the participation of competent women in parish and diocesan councils, pastoral councils? And I want to underline the question of competence. Too often, we value loyalty over competency. How are young women being supported in the process of discernment, theological education, and personal formation as they prepare for mandated ecclesial ministries? Are women catechists, pastoral caregivers, youth ministers, and chaplains installed in public liturgical celebrations by their pastors and bishops and supported by the prayer of their parish and diocesan communities? Where can we create spaces to listen and learn from their experience in discerning the pastoral priorities of the local church? These are the people on the front line every day. The present norms of canon law provide for a council of priests to advise the bishops on the needs and priorities of a diocese. Given the prevalence of permanent deacons and lay ecclesial ministers today, new diocesan structures must be found that will ensure that the voices of all pastoral workers be included in this kind of discernment. I believe we need to envision new structures that will provide a space for regular meetings with the entire body of frontline ecclesial ministers in the local church, where this diversity of ministries is honored and greater collaboration is encouraged. These are some of the ways we might ensure that the voice of competent women is taken into account in diocesan and parish decision-making without a single change to existing ecclesiastical law. A similar rethinking of structures needs to happen at the level of regional and national conferences of bishops. Pope Francis has suggested a model when, on occasion, he has sought a parity of men and women on important commissions. In some contexts, women are already serving in ministries that one might characterize as diaconal. Just as the office of the permanent diaconate for men was restored following the Second Vatican Council, it's time that we restore the office of permanent diaconate for women. This step would provide sacramental recognition of the works of service and evangelization being accomplished by competent women and enhance their integration into the liturgical life of the Church. Despite much resistance and fear, a powerful wave of lay and religious women continues to pursue theological education and formation in the pastoral skills required to serve in a rich variety of ministries in the Church and society today. They do so with a deep conviction that they are called by God's Spirit through baptism to follow Christ in this way. While they do not share in the authority conferred by ecclesial office, they do move with a conviction deeply rooted in their baptismal calling and are nourished by a rich life and experience of faith. Setting out onto uncharted paths, they're living into a new reality of new ministries. These new realities are still waiting to be received by the very communities they have been sent to serve. Ours is a time of considerable challenge, but also of great promise, one that calls to mind the words of the prophet Isaiah. Behold, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you perceive it? I am making a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert. Thank you.
Dr. Clifford a chance to just...
I'll get another lozenge is what I'm going to do.
So we don't have microphones tonight, but I suspect that if you're like me, that a lot of questions and dialogue has been stirred. So please speak loudly, and maybe if we need to repeat questions for the sake of the recording, then we'll do that. But we have a good half hour for questions if you would like to.
Yeah, I apologize. You're getting my voice about an octave lower than usual tonight because of this thing I have in my chest. So, yes.
What would you say are the odds of women becoming ordained as deacons?
So the question, for those of you who didn't hear it, is what are the odds of women being ordained as deacons? I think there's no reason not to. And we've had now several studies by theological commissions and by the Canon Law Society of America. I think we have to have bishops who request the authority to do so. So the fact that we have permanent men as permanent deacons is a decision of the local bishop. And strangely, I think this is also maybe of concern to us, 97% of those men are in North America, or in the Americas. So it's not being implemented in every context of the world. But we should ask if we believe that the structuring of ministers includes deacons, presbyters, and bishops, then something should be felt as missing when we don't have ordained deacons, because they symbolize for us sacramentally the link between the preaching of the gospel and the church's service to the world. So I think it's a ministry we're still discovering. And as I say, I think that there's good reason to do it. For the reason that the Vatican II gave the possibility for the bishops to ordain permanent deacons was because they said men are already doing this ministry, and so they should be ordained. And I think we're at a very similar case right now for many women who are engaged in diaconal ministries.
Dr. Clifford, can I ask a point of clarification? Are you saying that it is the purview of our local bishops to decide on women as permanent deacons?
It's the permission presently of every local bishop to decide whether his diocese will have married men as permanent deacons or not. And so I think Pope Francis has made noises to the effect of saying, well, first of all, we should be open to the question of married men being ordained to the presbyterate, and the question of the women's diaconate is an open question. He's invited for the study of this commission, which has said there's pretty clear evidence, historical evidence, that this was a traditional ministry of women in the early church. So we have a precedent for it. And so the question would be, is there a pastoral need for this? Then it's up to the bishop to implement it.
Yeah, I was particularly struck by your discussion around the development of lay ecclesial ministers and how that's really emerged, particularly since the Second Vatican Council. Could you talk a little bit about the education, the formation of lay ecclesial ministers, and what you see as the strengths and perhaps the weaknesses of that, where we could be doing a better job in hiring?
Yeah, I think when we fail to accompany lay men and women who feel a call to lay ministry, they themselves, the best studies have been done in the United States and authored by or edited by Zini Fox, and they have followed over several decades now the development of this, and there was a group of American theologians involved in developing their text called, is it Collaborators, Cooperators in Workers in the Vineyard? Something, anyway.
Emerging model for pastoral ministry is the big research project that she has.
Yeah, but she's pretty clear that a lot of lay men and women go through their theological education with no connection to a local church, and so they graduate without a sufficiently ecclesial understanding of their calling. It's understood in too narrow and personal terms. I have a vocation, I have a call. But they're not being accompanied by a community that says, yes, we recognize the call and we want to support you, we want to walk with you. So lay ministers get attached to a single parish, and they're not ready to move in service to a wider local church, and they're not dependent always on the bishop, and so they're in a very precarious situation. And I think we need to think harder about the kinds of structures at the diocesan level that would support these persons and help them to develop their gifts and their identity as members of what I've called before in some of my publications the ministerial core of the local church. So the body of all ministers in the local church. If you think of Ignatius of Antioch's vision of the local church, it's the people of God gathered together in one place around the bishop, who's assisted by all the ministers, his collaborators, who serve the people of God in this place. And that group of ministers includes deacons, presbyters, and today it includes also these lay workers. And we need to find a place where they're more integrated and they feel more part of the whole.
I know there's been discussion in this diocese around the ecclesial ministers having, say, the MDF. So, in your view, I mean, is that something particular to this diocese, or is this kind of a growing trend?
I think it's an institutional need, and I speak out of. I was one of the first lay pastoral associates in the Diocese of Hamilton back in the 1980s. I'm dating myself here, but nobody knew what to do with us, so they just invited us, to the deanery meetings, to the zone meetings, and we felt and we were received not equally by all the priests, but I think there's a proper place of inclusion in those various structures. Yes, at the back?
On the role of women in the church, I noticed in my reading that bishops, when they retire, will come out and say more about that women should have a role in the church. Are the bishops just afraid to use their authority, and then when they retire, they don't have that authority anymore, so therefore...
Well, if you could hear between the lines in the story I was trying to tell here, we've been through a generation of terrible pressure and control, theologically, but also where bishops themselves, and this is one of the reasons Pope Francis has been elected as Bishop of Rome by non-European, non-curial cardinals, because many bishops were very, very frustrated at the failure to listen by people governing the church at the center, the Pope and the Roman Curia. And so it was widely understood, and I knew this when I began my teaching career, that probably the questions you would fear the most in any interview would have to be, how do you see the church's teaching on women and women's ordination and homosexuality? And people who spoke out about these questions were disciplined. So there's it's been it's had the unfortunate effect of closing down serious dialogue and conversation, because it's clear we don't have a consensus on these things, but Archbishop Paul-André du Rocher continues to speak out, and he has spoken up in the International Synod of Bishops on the question of women's diaconal ministries. So I think there are more bishops that are feeling freer now to speak more about this. Yes?
I think, like, even if you just take the parish level, there's so much fear and anxiety about women getting up on the pulpit and saying something. And there's a lot of false teaching about it, and it's not corrected by our priests and people who should be. I sat at a meeting with actually our bishop was there, and I said, you know, occasionally I'd like to hear a woman's voice from the pulpit. And it was women that spoke up and said, well, you know, Christ, the apostles were all men, you know, that whole thing. And so I just feel like I can understand why women don't want this in the church, and is it go back to what you said, it's about loyalty, and, I mean, are we just meant to make coffee and do coffee Sundays for the rest of our lives, and?
Well, let's be clear also, not all women are called to be, or feel a call to ordination either.
No, I understand that, and I know it's not for everybody,
Mhm.
but I'm just saying, for the general people sitting at
Yeah.
one parish meeting or another, there's so much fear about this.
What are we afraid of? If people, if we are committed as a community to engaging competent men and women in ministry, what would we have to be afraid of?
I mean, I don't know.
Yes.
There's something kind of below the surface, and Pope Francis himself has spoken of it. So structure is one thing,
Yes.
but attitude in the structure
Yeah.
is called clericalism.
Yes.
And that is much harder.
Yes.
You know, you don't just rearrange the doors and where the windows are. Attitudes and generational attitudes are
Yes.
way different things.
Yes, and let's be clear, it's not just the clergy who are guilty of clericalism.
I know.
So we have a laity who's infantilized and who has the notion that Father knows best, and so it also allows the lay people to avoid their own responsibility. So we need to grow up as a community, and we do need to get beyond that culture of clericalism. Absolutely. And I would say, I don't want to harp on the ordination question, but just as a point of information, the people most engaged in the women's ordination movement, those women are not interested in being part of the present structure and culture of ministry. They want it to change. So, yeah. Yes.
Is it connected to the ability to deliver a homily as a woman? Is that connected to the fact that there are not deacons?
No, if your bishop wanted to authorize you tomorrow to give a homily, you could.
But it's not done.
No, it's not.
Usually done.
No, it's not. But I'm.
In any place?
Yes, it is. In some places, it is. Of course, we have places where women are parish administrators, where women preside at the Sunday celebration of the Eucharist in the absence of a priest, and they're preaching regularly.
It's in very remote places, though, usually, isn't it?
It's less and less remote. I mean, it's more and more the reality in rural areas, in many churches today. There was a question back here.
It's more of a comment, and I look at sort of the age of this room, and I think that the new generation, those 20, 30-year-olds, their disconnect from the church is because it doesn't function in the same way of their understanding of their own equality, of their own ability to do things. So they come into a place that has this clericism, and that's not something they affiliate with. And they don't see themselves as being equal, or it just seems foreign to them. Like, you know, like you go back to how you said something, it's hard for your nieces to understand not being a person. But the 20-year-olds, they can't even understand why they're still not. Like, it just doesn't make sense to them. And so I think for the church to move in a direction of change, it has to look at the way that young people understand themselves as equal and capable and competent.
Yeah.
This is foreign to them.
I think that's true, and I think the colleague I was quoting here has zeroed in on the fact of young Catholic women, what they value is what they call authenticity. This is what Charles Taylor is also talking about, that people, young people, have an innate sense of justice, and they know if you're not real. So, you know, if we've got people preaching every Sunday about how we're all belong to one happy family and we're all have the same dignity as the baptized, and then they go around and can't talk to each other and can't work together and can't value each other's different gifts, we're just, they get this. They see the counter witness of this. So we have to get real in our living witness and our practice, it seems to me. And I'm sure there's a lot of parents who have just told their daughters, don't waste your time in the church, dear. It's not a place for you.
So, maybe being one of the younger ones, youngest girl, I pulled on a lot of strings for me, because a lot of our generation, and you said it, sort of, a lot of our generation is saying, I don't know how you do this, Maya. I don't know how you work for the church. But you talked about so many important things and how far we've come. And sometimes I don't understand it, and I have conversations with my mom even, and people in my family, and there's this hope and change. But I think, yes, we talked about it at dinner too, the bishop, and this authenticity, and but there has to be, oh my goodness, we need to go back to scripture. And while we believe very much in our Catholic tradition and scripture, and that they go very much hand in hand, I'm starting to question our tradition and what it's stemmed from. You spoke early about, you know, where the that we really are and continue to be, it's a patriarch, pardon? Yes, the patriarchal, but it's, that stems from a culture that was, and we have come so far. But if we go back over 2,000 years ago, Christ was meeting the woman at the well, and not, you know, his disciples came to him and said, they were shocked that they met this woman at the well. Mary Magdalene was the first to tell the disciples that, you know, the Lord has risen. But at first they didn't believe her. And those roles, while I believe that I'm a feminist and my husband is a feminist, I think we're missing what that word means in our culture. And it's not feeling like I'm winning to be part of the church. And that it's not the same playing field. I think women have we have a different role. And I'm sensitive to say that because I hear how things can change and grow. But I struggle because I believe that our role is different. You know, even, I'm learning about letters of Paul right now in my class, and even the way Paul talks of himself as he goes into these communities, and he wants to give some authority, but he also wants them to learn on their own. And he describes himself sometimes in motherly and fatherly ways. I don't know where I was going with this, but I have to tell people, as they continually say to me, how do you, either people have leave, they're too frustrated, and my husband has been, God bless him, the first to say, what are we going to tell her? We can't leave. We're not leaving, Maya. We have a role to 2 daughters that we have, and 1 son, you know. And I don't want to say that we want to be part of a change, because I don't know if, who knows if I'll be there to see that lived out. But to acknowledge that that we were part of something that we believe really truly is hopeful.
Maya, you are the change. And I had to learn that as a young student 40 years ago, when people looked at me and said, "What in God's name are you going to do, my dear?" And I said, "I don't know, I'm having such a good time." But I also feel your pain, because I've been pained to see some of my colleagues and students leave the church in frustration. My conviction is we must be the change. And if we leave, our church is poorer for it. So I'm grateful that you're willing to put your gifts at the service of our community. And I hope you find the support and welcome that we can honor the gifts that you bring. That's the challenge that we all have, it seems to me, to accompany the men and women who are coming forward to serve today. And so thank you. Yes, Connie.
Like Marion, I think a little bit, there's what's underpinning this or underlying this. For me, it's come to understand that there's something at the crux of this that's very disingenuous. That, I think every day I understand Pope Francis less and less. He's really becoming a bit of an enigma or something. But for him to call women, or to say that women belong in these decision-making processes and are needed, much more needed in the church, and their role needs to be recognized and affirmed, but not to put those big pieces on the table. That, ministry, like who ministers? We're not ministerially whole because we have deacons, priests, and bishops. We would be ministerially whole if every ministry was open to the whole people of God. That would be much more helpful in my thinking. Everything that you mention about the possibility of ministry, because we don't deal with those big pieces of governance and ministry and decision-making, it's left to the whim or the stance of the current pope, the current bishop, the current pastor.
Mm-hmm.
There isn't that, there's no guarantee for people who are in lay ministry today. There's no protections for it. There's protections according to what the province of Ontario says, that protection, but their ministry is not. There's no protection for that. And unless those big pieces are on the table and we can really grapple with them, and change can happen at that level, we're going to hear these platitudes again, and I don't mean to disparage what you're saying, but we're going to hear that and hear that and hear that, and in the end, young people recognize that there is something unjust and disingenuous in what is going forward.
Thank you. I think that's very close to what I was trying to say, that until there is inclusion structurally, we can't even imagine how these ministries can change. So until women have a voice at the table, we can't move forward together. Yes?
My question is about language for God in our teaching, our documents, and our liturgy, official liturgies. And you touched on that and how that shapes our thinking of what is normative, what humanity, and church. Could you say more about that, please?
Well, that's a very big question. I mentioned, the unfortunate lack of inclusive language in the prayer of our community. That's very off-putting for many people, and I think we have to be honest about that. I also think there's been some very creative work done by scholars on these questions. So I don't despair of it entirely. when I think of the work of Elizabeth Johnson in her book She Who Is. One of the reasons I value her work so much is one of my feminist colleagues says she's not a real feminist because she doesn't reject the tradition. But there are many women like her who are really trying to retrieve the fullness of the tradition and to think about it in creative ways and to help us discover the feminine language for God that's present in our tradition. So Beth Johnson builds on the Sophia, the wisdom tradition of the scriptures for language to speak about God, about the Trinity. I think we all need to be much more self-aware of our language and our representations of God. And we need to be pretty clear. Once and for all, we need to understand God is not a sexuated being. And the only reason we use these words is because we're trying to grasp something of the intimacy of the relationship that God desires with all of us. And our language is very, very limited. John?
Thank you for the talk, Kathy. In your first quote from Pope Francis, he used the phrase feminine genius.
Yes, it's a term from Pope John Paul II.
Right, and later you talked about some of the problematic aspects of a kind of vision of complementarity. I wonder, do you see a phrase like that? Is there any insight there that is helpful? And I'm rather suspicious of the language of complementarity. On the other hand, I teach at the seminary, and the vast majority of the students are male seminarians. But when you have even a single lay woman in class, it changes the dynamic every time.
This is good.
Always in a good way. Always in a
Makes
good
people
way.
accountable, yes.
And so I'm wondering if you could just reflect a little bit on that. If you think there is any value in that kind of concept of feminine genius,
Yeah.
or is that inherently problematic?
I don't think, I don't want to deny that there are differences between men and women, but I think it's very, very hard to define them in hard categories, hard and fast categories. And I think we see a clue of the importance of maybe a balanced notion of complementality in the account of Genesis, when it's male and female together that image God. So the full image of God is man and woman together. And you know, so what I feel like, what's his name there, who did that movie, What Women Want?
Mel Gibson.
Yeah, I'm not big on Mel Gibson, but I think what the best feminist scholarship is aiming for is a world where men and women live together in communion and harmony and as collaborators. So to me, that's a more balanced image or representation of, I think, who God wants us to be than either one of them alone. So something in us is not complete without the other. And that's a very mysterious thing. And beyond that, I'm not sure what kind of terminology to use for it. And even the term feminine genius is kind of problematic. So then what do men bring? You still have, well, the rational spirit, or I don't know. Yeah. Yes.
When you were commenting on intern seniores, and it's weak, you described it as the weak theology, that argumentation that when because the priest is acting in the person of Christ, the person of Christi,
I'm not denying that the priest acts in the person of Christ.
There should be a natural resemblance, as the
Yeah.
document says. I think that's a very generous evaluation of that theology.
Thank you.
Because for me, if there's anything close to heretical, that is it. The priest should resemble Christ, but the natural resemblance, some have very crudely said that one has to have a penis in order to celebrate Mass, but that is just so wrong.
Well, the
for me.
troubling suggestion is that women are not fully redeemed.
Yes.
That's
how
the
would you
problem.
realistically evaluate that language as a theologian?
Well, as I say, I think it's a very serious theological problem that suggests that only half the human race is fully redeemed.
The Anglican Church has had deacons, female deacons, priests, and bishops for quite a while now, and apparently the church hasn't fallen apart. So, in fact,
Maybe we should ask Bishop Linda to give us her take on this.
So, I mean, I think there's a lot to be learned by it.
Well, let's be clear about the experience of the Anglican Communion and our other Christian brothers and sisters in other churches. They're not in full agreement about this in every culture. So women are not being ordained in every province of the Anglican Communion. And it must be very painful. So when Bishop Linda travels to some Anglican provinces, she's not recognized as a bishop. She's not received as a bishop. And it's,
They've only had bishops in England since 2015.
yes. So,
That's very recent.
so I think we have to be very honest also about the life of the Catholic Church. The largest Christian family in the world with 1.3 billion members. It's a question I put to my students sometime. How do you want to move them all? How do you propose to introduce any change in a way that would be meaningful in every culture? And I have this, some years ago, about 10 years ago, I was invited to this, it's a little further back, this really extraordinary conversation. And this was in the era where, the lid was on this whole conversation. Not just about women in ministry, but about ministries. And a group of church leaders organized a conversation that took place there were about 25 bishops, Catholic bishops from all around the world, with a handful of theologians. And I was one of 3 women at this meeting. And we all flew to Brussels, and they shipped us out into the countryside and left us in a retreat house for 5 days to talk to each other about the state of ministry in the church today. And every bishop to a person said, the biggest challenge I have are my priests. I don't know what to do with them. And they're trying to think about new forms of priesthood, the possibility of ordaining married priests. And I have to say, many of these bishops were from the Southern Hemisphere and had never met a woman theologian before. So the other 2 women, one was a little religious sister in a gray habit, a Sacred Heart sister, who's a professor of theology in Seoul, South Korea. And the other is a very active lay woman, Virginia Saldana, in India, who's been an advisor or run the office of the laity for the Federation of Asian Bishops' Conferences. And I thought, oh my goodness, the only North American woman here, you cannot raise the women's issue. It has to come from someplace else. And one day in the conversation it came up, and this little sister from South Korea says, because the bishops were talking about celibacy, and she said, well, in my culture, the people would not trust a religious leader who's not celibate. But they don't understand why we don't have women priests, because the Buddhists do. And for me, a light went off, and I said, my God, this isn't theological, it's cultural. I don't think we understand enough how much our attitudes toward human sexuality are freighted with our cultural presuppositions. We're not even conscious of them. And I don't know what the answer is to that, but I think that today it's very interesting listening to Catholic women theologians from Africa and India and the Philippines who are actually very militant right now about their place in the church, and it's fascinating to watch them find a voice. So that gives me some hope. I'm not sure how we're going to change these things, but I think it will be incrementally, and it won't happen equally and at the same pace in every cultural context. I'll have to stop there.
So unfortunately, we have to stop there. We're in time.
Thank you. Okay.
Dr. Clifford, it's thank you so much.